What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Ryan Thomas. I am coming to you live, a little bit under the weather, but nonetheless, feeling a little bit better. Feeling like I can give you guys a really good show tonight on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Wanted to hop on here in studio T-Take, and give you guys my take on the retirement of George St.Pierre. I touched on it very briefly, and I thought to myself, right, come on, man. You gotta go in depth. You gotta give the people what they want. You gotta give the people what they deserve, and what George St.Pierre deserves is a proper send-off. Now, everybody knows that I believe that George St.Pierre is the best fighter in UFC history. I don't think it's really an argument that he is the best, and I'll, list off my reasons as to why I feel that is the case. But for now, I have to admit, as a fight fan, the last few weeks, the last couple weeks, the week since that George St.Pierre decided to retire, I really took to UFC Fight Pass, which is something that I've been a subscriber of for a little while now. And I watched all of his fights. I don't want to say all of them, but I watched the majority of his fights. Knew every ins and out of his fight. And as I watched his fights, I remembered where I was when I was watching him, who I was with when I was watching him. Just thinking of the fact that this fighter named George St.Pierre from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, had his own era in which he existed in the sport, an era that spanned over a decade. And to know that, I basically grew up watching this guy fight in the UFC when they were fighting in the Mandalay Bay and the MGM Grand, and then from the MGM Grand to the Center Bell, fighting Carlos Condit and Nick Diaz, and fighting Johnny Hendricks, and taking this 4-year layoff that ultimately was probably the best thing for George St.Pierre, given that when he came back, he looked better than ever. Did face some adversity in that Michael Bisping middleweight title fight, but nonetheless was able to drop with a left hook and then choke unconscious the then middleweight champion Michael Bisping to win that middleweight title and cement his legacy as a champ and winning two titles and two divisions in the sport. And that was a huge achievement. That was a huge night for mixed martial arts, UFC 217. November 4th, 2017, you had GSP beating Bisping, you had Dillashaw beating Garbrandt to get his bantamweight title back, and you had Rose Namajunas defeating Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and that card in and of itself was just so memorable. First UFC card ever to have all three challengers defeat all incoming champions, and it was one that is still leaving an effect on the sport to this day in the bantamweight and the strawweight divisions, and as well as the middleweight division. So it was just really awesome to see that fight, to see him get that comeback victory, and that was ultimately the victory that he rode off into the sunset with. And I've always thought that as a fight fan, you have to have a favorite fighter. You have to have one guy or girl that you look at and say, wow, they are truly great. And early on in watching the UFC and watching MMA for the first time, I remember realizing that, oh, this guy's great at jiu-jitsu. Oh, this guy's great at kickboxing. Oh, this guy's great at wrestling. George St.Pierre, to me, was the first guy that made me think, as a, however old I was when I first saw him fight. It's probably 2003, 2004, so 12 or 13 years old when I first saw George St.Pierre step in the octagon versus Carl Parisian. I thought to myself, that's the only guy I've seen thus far that has every art, that has mastered every art, that can flash every single art within a fight, whether it's boxing, wrestling, kickboxing, Muay Thai, jiu-jitsu. He brought it all to the table in that fight. And to date myself, that was back, I believe that was 2004. but I could look it up for us right here, right now, as I'm coming down with a cold here, I think. But he was the first guy that I truly thought to myself, this guy is a true mixed martial artist. Guy that is well-versed in every facet of mixed martial arts. His first fight in the UFC was January 31st, 2004, and it was titled UFC 46 Supernatural. January 31st, 2004, Randy Couture fought Vitor Belfort for what I believe was the UFC light heavyweight title. In what was a TKO stoppage, BJ Penn defeated Matt Hughes that night in a huge upset. Frank Mir knocked out Wes Sims, which is on Frank Mir's highlight reel. George St.Pierre for this fight card, was on the prelims, main eventing the prelims. George St.Pierre versus Carl Parisian, and Josh Thompson versus Hermes Franca. And another fight at lightweight consisted of Matt Serra versus Jeff Curran. So that just goes to show you how long ago that was. You know, how long this fighter, George St.Pierre, has been around and been one of the main faces of the sport. And to chronologically take you through his career, from that moment on, he knocked out Jay Haran. He fought Matt Hughes for the vacant welterweight title, losing via submission. And he fought Dave Strasser in TKO 19 Rage, which was a Canadian MMA promotion. And back into the UFC, fighting Jason Mayhem Miller, beating Frank Trigg, beating Sean Shirk. And then the most high-profile fight of his career at that time was fighting BJ Penn, March 4th, 2006, UFC 58. You had Rich Ace Franklin versus David Loiseau, who I remember was looked at as one of the up-and-coming fighters of his time. And I know that I've said a lot of these things about George St.Pierre already, but I really don't think people understand the weight that this guy holds in mixed martial arts. Maybe mixed martial arts fans now see fighters like Conor McGregor and John Jones and maybe even Ronda Rousey as all-time greats. But before those three fighters, there was George St.Pierre. This guy carried the UFC on his back for a long, long time, fighting multiple times a year while defending that title. And that's one of the reasons why he needed to go away. He needed to take a break, needed to clear out the cobwebs. I remember there was a stat during the moment of watching the Johnny Hendricks fight. George St.Pierre basically said that he had really needed to just clear some time, take some time off once that fight was over. But during one of the moments of the fight, the UFC showed a graphic that George St.Pierre had spent a total of 5 hours inside the octagon fighting. You really think about that. 5 hours. A lot of decision victories, but a lot of fighting. A lot of getting punched in the face, getting taken down, or getting in holds and submissions and everything. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the reasons why this guy needed to go away. And this is a fighter that had peaks and flows as a phenom, climbing up the ladder, climbing to the top of the sport, becoming the champion, then losing that title in a true upset. Still to this day, from my opinion, if George St.Pierre is the greatest of all time, well, the first time he loses his title, that is the greatest upset of all time, featuring Matt Serra, UFC 69, that was. TKO punches, and that was in April of 2007 in Houston, Texas. Bounces back with a win over Josh Koscheck, decision, submits Matt Hughes for the armbar to win the UFC interim welterweight championship because Matt Serra had been out for a long time with a devastating injury. Matt Serra signs on the bottom line to fight George St. Pierre again, and that one ended pretty much like the first fight should have. A year later, George finishes it via TKO knees to the body, April 19th, 2008, my grandma's birthday. So then you have this run that ensues where George St. Pierre fights the then undefeated John Fitch, the then UFC lightweight champion BJ Penn, the then number one contender Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ace Thiago Alves, then the devastating striker Dan Hardy, then he fights Jess Koscheck again, then he fights the former Strikeforce champion Jake Shields, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ace as well, phenom as well. Then he fights the natural-born killer Carlos Condit, who was the then interim UFC welterweight champ, former WEC welterweight champ. Then he fights Nick Diaz, former Strikeforce champ, number one contender. Then he fights Johnny Hendricks, number one contender. Then he fights UFC middleweight champion Michael Bisping. And in all those fights, they were all wins. Decision or not, George St. Pierre mastered the art of following the game plan and implementing the game plan. If we're going to talk about records, 3-time champion in the UFC, 2 times at welterweight, 1 time at middleweight, and had won fight of the night 4 times versus Fitch, Koscheck, Condit, Hendricks, knockout of the night, submission of the night, performance of the night versus Michael Bisping, the most UFC title fight wins ever, the 3rd most consecutive title defenses in UFC history, the 4th multi-divisional champion in UFC history, most wins by decision in UFC history, 12, most takedowns in UFC history, 90, most successful title defenses in UFC welterweight history, 9, most consecutive, 9. So to say that this guy is the greatest welterweight, that's a definite. But a facet of George St. Pierre's career that is not really talked about enough is that in 2010, Team Canada versus Team USA, Winter Olympics in Vancouver, Sidney Crosby pumps the puck in between Ryan Miller's legs. It's an image I know Buffalo Sabres fans do not want to reimagine. But that happens. Sidney Crosby gets the game-winning goal. Canada gets the gold medal wrapped around their necks. And when they did a vote as to who was the Canadian Athlete of the Year, George St. Pierre won that vote, not Sidney Crosby. So that puts into perspective the massive star that George St. Pierre was, is, and always will be in Canada, to Canada, not just to his own province, but to that entire land. True Canadian icon. So much so that when he decided to retire, they held a press conference for him at the Centre Bell in Montreal, then invited him to the game later that night where the Montreal Canadiens took the ice. Beforehand, they saluted their native son, George Rush St. Pierre. What a beautiful send-off that was. What a honorable send-off that was for a guy that really deserved it. And George St. Pierre didn't have a DWI. George St. Pierre didn't have battery issues, abuse, domestic violence, whatever you want to call it. George St. Pierre didn't test positive for any steroid. George St. Pierre was the quintessential company man. Never did anything to hurt the UFC. Never did anything to taint the title whatsoever. Held the title with integrity. Fought all comers. Fought all challengers. Beat them all. Fought them all. And yes, even the greats sometimes have to walk away and say to themselves, this just isn't worth it. And I think that's a deeper issue than what people realize. This guy was campaigning for the UFC to bring in any sort of drug testing program that they possibly could. He said, I believe that this company should have drug testing. The fact that we don't is a major issue. The UFC kind of said, yeah, you're right, but where do we start? How do we do it? How do we make it happen? George says, I'll start testing USADA. I'll start entering into the USADA testing pool. I will test for this fight versus Johnny Hendricks because I know Johnny Hendricks is on something. There's no way a fighter could just touch a chin and the guy goes flying across the octagon as if he has no control over his own human body. Watch the Johnny Hendricks-John Fitch fight, and you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Watch the Johnny Hendricks-Martin Kampmann fight, then you'll really understand what I'm talking about. So George had a point there. He said, we need drug testing. We need something to happen. We need something to change. And if it doesn't, I'm out. And his stance was so strong that he said, well, I'll decide to take the USADA testing. I'll prove that I'm a negative on this test, that I will not fail the test. Let's see if Johnny can prove that he will pass the test. Well, basically, yeah, not fail, pass yet. George says, I'm not going to test positive, but let's see if Johnny Hendricks will test positive. So George takes the test. Johnny takes a different type of test to prove that he is negative. Does not take the top of the heap drug testing program that was USADA. Takes VADA and something else I've never even heard of. George signs to fight him anyway. What ensues is probably the closest fight in George St.Pierre's career, and it's a fight that I just watched. It's a fight that I honestly believe that Johnny Hendricks, for 25 minutes, fought GSP probably better than anybody ever has or ever will. Definitely or ever will. Outside of Matt Serra, outside of Matt Hughes. And based on these reasons of Johnny Hendricks deciding not to take the same drug test that George St.Pierre did, I believe that the judges said, hey, this guy's not good for the sport. The other guy is great for the sport. The other guy's an all-time great. He's a legend. And it was a pretty close fight. We're going to go with the other guy. We're going to go with the guy that makes the sport look good. We're not going to go with the guy that makes the sport look terrible, whether he means to or not. So I thought GSP won rounds 1, 3, and 5 out of that fight. First round, close, but it's the first round. Hendricks didn't really land a whole lot until the second round. Third round, I thought GSP bounced back really nicely. Fourth round, Hendricks did a little bit. Fifth round, I thought GSP looked phenomenal. And that's the last round of the fight. So if one fighter looks phenomenal in the final round, the fifth and final round, the other one looks a little so-so, oftentimes the one that looks phenomenal that final round is going to get the nod. As crazy as that sounds. That's what happens. And that's what happened that night. November of 2013, UFC 167. And I know so many fight fans that always say to me, oh, he lost to Matt Serra. Yeah, he did lose to Matt Serra. He got KTFO'd. You know what that stands for. By Matt Serra. There's no doubt about that. But he came back, fought a few fights, including Matt Hughes, who was a tough SOB, fought Matt Serra again, and completely destroyed him. So we're really going to focus on that one fight, not talk about what happened after that fight, and then after he beat Matt Serra, what this guy went on to accomplish in the sport, what his destiny was in the sport was to be this long-time reigning, defending, undisputed champion. And he accomplished that. Sabres go up 1-0, by the way. Power play goal, Jack Eichel. So, I'm not going to say that George St.Pierre didn't lose those fights. He did, but he avenged both of them. He avenged the Matt Hughes, lost twice. Fought him once, beat him twice. Lost him once, beat him twice. Fought Matt Serra once, beat him another times. They're even. 1-1. Maybe eventually they'll do a 3 at heavyweight because Matt Serra's a little thick now. But when I look at the historical significance of mixed martial arts, if I have, let's just say, a son someday, and we're talking about, the legends of fighting like me and my dad have always done ever since I was a little kid. We've always talked about Mike Tyson. We've always talked about Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, Sugar Ray Leonard, Sugar Ray Robinson, Mayweather Pacquiao, Mickey Ward, Arturo Gatti, Winky Wright, Oscar de la Hoya. And you notice here, I'm naming boxers because boxing has a historical significance advantage over mixed martial arts. It's got more years under its belt. The UFC just celebrated their 25th anniversary. The UFC is the major mixed martial arts organization. And despite how well Bellator has been doing, despite how well ONE FC is about to do, despite how well the Pro Fight League is about to do, who just signed a new 2-year deal with ESPN, by the way, the UFC is the cream of the crop. It is MMA. MMA equals UFC. It's as far as major sports leagues. But when I look back 20, 25, 30 years from now, I'm going to be able to say I watched the greatest from the start. I got to watch the all-time best fight in mixed martial arts in this sport. So the historical significance of boxing now, 20, 30, 40 years from now, the historical significance of boxing will be MMA. The historical significance, basically, is what I'm trying to say, will hold the same weight. And George St.Pierre will be one of those guys. As many times as, we have another fighter win another belt, or as many times we might have another fighter in the welterweight division's history surpass one of George St.Pierre's records. George created the record. George created 9 consecutive title offenses. George created 90 takedowns in UFC history. George created 900,000 to 1 million pay-per-view buys. George created fighting in 55,000 seat arenas, 55,000 seat stadiums, I should say, in the Rogers Center in Toronto, sold out for his fight versus Jake Shields, oddly enough, on my 19th birthday. Coincidence? I think not. Randy Couture's final fight ever in his mixed martial arts career against Lyoto Machida, which did not end well for Randy, but we can't knock the great Randy Couture. But anywho, that's the first champ right there, Randy Couture. So anywho, George St.Pierre created these records, and no matter who comes along and who might pass them, let's just say Tyron Woodley defends that belt 9 times, which I don't think is going to happen, but let's just say he does. Then we really have a level of excellence that we can compare it to. George created that level of excellence that most people can't even dream of having. And here's a guy that made his name at the first peak of his career. You really think about this. The first moment in his career where everyone thought he would just win, he lost. Really think about that. The biggest moment of his career at the time, 2007, we MMA fans think that this guy is about to embark on a run that he eventually embarked on. But we thought it was going to happen then. And it was delayed. From the first moment where George St.Pierre had to really show that he was this end-all, be-all, greatest of all time, he lost. But it's not about losing in MMA. It's about how you dust yourself up and dust yourself off and get back on the horse. Wins and losses in mixed martial arts is just another day at the office, essentially. We've seen fighters lose. We saw Anderson Silva lose to Chris Weidman. We saw Conor lose to Nate Diaz. We saw GSP lose to Matt Serra. We saw him lose to Matt Hughes. Some of the best, most significant fighters in UFC history have lost. The only one that hasn't is John Jones, which, yeah, that's true, but he's lost a lot of other things, including respect. And that's one thing that George St.Pierre can never say that he lost. Everybody respects that guy. If you talk to the MMA fighters, the fraternity of fighters, if you want to call it that, you'd ask where GSP ranks all time, they're either going to say he's the best ever or pretty damn near close. One of the two. His fight versus Carlos Condit was a war. His fight versus BJ Penn was true, total domination, especially the second time. First time he had some adversity. Second time, BJ Penn quit. BJ Penn doesn't quit. BJ Penn's the guy that knocks you unconscious and licks the blood off his gloves. George St. Pierre made him quit. This guy's off. This guy's out of the sport. Nobody's talking about him. Only the diehards, like myself. We think that he's done. We think that the book has been written. We think that the book is closed. The story is over. Close the storybook, whatever you want to call it. This guy decides, hey, yeah, I do want to come back. 2 years into a retirement / hiatus, he says he does want to come back. Takes the UFC 2 years to get it together. I remember when he first started talking about coming back, Robbie Lawler was the UFC welterweight champ. And I always thought, if he would have come back, what's the point of picking up where you left off at welterweight? Let's start a new journey. Let's start a new chapter, whether it's at middleweight or lightweight. I honestly thought that this guy, George St. Pierre, would have a better chance at having another dominant run at lightweight rather than moving up a weight class. But moving up is always seen in fighting as a big balls move. That's what George did. Moves up, fights Michael Bisping, one of the most game fighters in UFC history, who's finally a champion, and yes, faced his own adversity in the fight where it was thought where GSP would thrive. He did very poorly, and Bisping did very well. Where it was thought that Bisping would thrive, Bisping did very poorly. Bisping did bad on the stand-up. George did bad from top position after taking Bisping down. And that fight ends with George dropping and then choking out Michael Bisping. Who the hell would have ever thought that was going to happen? I actually said on the podcast it'd be a 3rd round, 4th round submission. And I believe I was right with the round. It was either the 3rd or 4th round, and I know it was obviously a submission. So I was right, but I didn't think it would happen like that. I thought it would happen where George is taking him down, and he's pounding him, he's wearing him out, and then Bisping just decides to roll to his stomach, and George just chokes him and taps. That's what I thought would happen. I didn't think we'd see this bloody back and forth war where Bisping would have his cup loose and all this crazy stuff happens. But that's what happened. And I was so thankful for that moment because I felt like I needed that moment as a fight fan. You feel like there's moments that you need. You feel like there's fights that you need that you might not ever get. And yeah, would it have been great to see him fight Khabib Nurmagomedov? Of course. I would have loved that fight. That would have been phenomenal. But at the end of the day, this guy did every single thing that he set out he was going to do. That he set out to do. He shut up every naysayer, everyone that said that he was a failure for losing against Matt Serra, that he never get the title back. He got the title back. He had this crazy run where he fought challenger after challenger after challenger, and I personally think that his run as welterweight champion is the best I've ever seen, because each challenger offered true reasons to believe that they could beat George St. Pierre. And yet George St. Pierre beat them at his game. I'm Ryan Thomas. George St. Pierre, the greatest to ever lace up the mixed martial arts gloves. Take care, everybody.